Welcome to our course in church history. I'm Dr. James Miller. In this course, we'll do a sweeping exploration of the last 2,000 years, looking at how the church interacted with the cultures and nations around it. We'll see how the story of Jesus grew from a small rural population in the Middle East to a global phenomenon welcoming billions of followers today. We'll discuss the early foundations of theology, mission, and martyrdom that laid the foundation for the church in the first 5 centuries, culminating in the life of Augustine of Hippo. It might be a surprise to some, but we'll discover that the church laid the foundation for the arts and the sciences that exploded out of the Middle Ages. We'll then follow the reformers through a season of upheaval and war that changed the face of Europe. Christianity was a significant voice in the shift to modernity, and we'll see that it remained a countercultural voice in the 20th century through the development of post-modernity, answering a bleak and mechanistic worldview with a promise of hope and love. Church history is the story of God's ongoing interactions with his human creation, a fascinating, passionate, and sometimes embarrassing look at the people of faith. I'm Dr. James Miller. Welcome to Church History.
Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, we basically have no money for these videos.
Dun, 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 dun.
The impact of the life of St. Francis is not decided by the fact that today there are almost 300 Franciscan houses around the world and almost 5,000 Franciscan monks. Nor is it measured by the fact that the Catholic Church continues to honor him once a year on October 4th, his feast day, commemorating his death in 1226. He's not even most famous for the namesake metropolis San Francisco. Rather, his significance lies in the fact that he continues to shape the minds of historians and devotees with his lifestyle, a radical alternative to the ubiquitous pursuits of wealth, comfort, and normalcy. Francis' impact comes from being the only one in history to seemingly take so seriously the life and teachings of Jesus. Francis was born in 1181, born as Giovanni de Pietro de Bernardoni, son of Pietro and Pica de Bourlemont, a French noblewoman. When he was a child, his father was a wealthy clothing merchant. One story continues to persist from his childhood. He encountered a beggar when out transacting business for his father. He finished a business deal and then chased the beggar down and gave to him all the money he had in his pockets, much to his father's chagrin. In 1202, Francis went and joined the army, and while at war, he was imprisoned and fell ill around the age of 21. He returned home and showed little interest in the military and the life of the wealthy. He said that he was going to be married to Lady Poverty, and he stopped going to sports events and to feasts. But it was not until 1205 that he received his vision, which would change the course of his life. He believed that in looking at an icon of Jesus, it spoke to him and said, "Go and repair my house, which is falling." He took that to mean the church there in Assisi. And so he sold his father's clothing and began to repair the chapel. In the midst of this transaction, his father became outraged and took him before the city courts to demand that his son repay him and to cut his son off from his inheritance. The legend goes that Francis, in front of the court and all the city, took off his clothes, stood naked in front of the city and in front of his father, and gave his clothing back to his father. He said that he was returning to his father everything that his father had given him. He then renounced his right to an inheritance. In the next 3 years, he spent time wandering around, living as a poor man, living among the beggars in the town. He went around begging for stones to rebuild the church at which he continued to work. He began to care for lepers. In 1208, now at the age of 27, he heard a sermon on the commissioning of the 12 disciples of Jesus, and he began traveling around and preaching. This was very unusual for the time because he had no clerical status. He wasn't licensed to preach. This wasn't something that you just did casually. These were all early signs of the alternative life that he was determined to live. The next year in 1209, he started to gather followers. First, there were just a dozen of them. He wrote a monastic rule, saying that it was dedicated to following the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and walking in his footsteps. With his little band of a dozen brothers, he went to Pope Innocent III and asked if he could constitute a monastic order. This was a well-established practice in the Middle Ages. It went back to St. Augustine, who himself wrote a monastic rule. And Augustinian monks had continued to exist for 1,000 years. However, the Pope saw that Francis' circle was a small one, and he said to come back when there were more of them. However, within the next year, Pope Innocent III had a dream in which he saw Francis holding up the Lateran Basilica, the seat of the Pope in Rome. He then endorsed the Franciscan order, what became called the Order of Friars Minor, the Lesser Brothers. Today you'll see it abbreviated OFM. Francis was later ordained a deacon in the church, but he never became a priest. In 1211, when he was about 30 years old, a woman named Clare, also of Assisi, also wealthy, started following him and applying his teachings to her life. She formed the Second Franciscan Order, or the Order of the Poor Clares. Within a decade, a third order was formed for those who could not leave their homes and work, but who practiced Franciscan principles in their daily life. If you go back and you read the biography written by Bonaventure, a Franciscan born in 1221, just before Francis died, one of the early followers of the Franciscans, you can see all kinds of fascinating stories attributed to Francis. Some will argue that this hagiography, this life of the saint, is somewhat fictitious. Others will say that this is as close as we get to an authentic biography. In it, Bonaventure captures stories of the order. There was once a moment in which one of the Franciscans was given a gold coin and was very proud of it and showed it to Francis. Francis insisted that the monk bury the coin in a pile of dung with his teeth to show him the value of gold. He told those who would come and join the Franciscan order that they must first give all their belongings to the poor. One man gave all of his belongings to his relatives instead of giving them to the poor, and then came to join Francis. But Francis, by the power of the Spirit, discerned that the man had not given his goods away to the poor, and he rejected the man and told him that he could not become a Franciscan. At that, Bonaventure tells us, he went back and collected all of his belongings back from his relatives again and did not live a life of poverty. Once, Francis, walking along with some of his followers, saw a bag of money on the road. One of the monks suggested taking it and giving it to the poor. But Francis refused, saying it was a trick of the devil. The monk continued to complain, so Francis went back with him to the bag of money and told him to pick it up. When this companion reached for it, a snake jumped out of the bag, and suddenly the bag and the snake disappeared. Francis told his brother, "Money is nothing but a devil and a snake to the servants of God." When one of Francis' followers mistakenly referred to his living space as "my room," Francis made them all change rooms to make sure they understood that they were to own nothing in this world. There's another story of one of Francis' followers stopping and looking in a window when he saw a beautiful woman. Francis, perceiving the desires of the man's heart, told him he could go and marry and be free. Francis meant to communicate a spirit of openness, that his movement was there for those who would volunteer to do it. But if someone wanted to pursue a life of marriage and settled life, they were free to do so. Francis' general teachings on money do reflect the teachings of Jesus. Jesus' teachings on money are almost all negative. He talks about money being a deception and a distraction. He talks about the love of money being a competition for the love of God. From what little we know of the lifestyle of Jesus, Jesus lived with very little. He himself said he had no place to lay his head. Christians throughout history have assimilated the teachings of Jesus into normal societal life. Francis seems to have taken the teachings of Jesus about money at face value and refused to pursue money the way most of us do. Francis also had a very different take on the nature of the world around him. Through the Middle Ages and into the Enlightenment, the animal kingdom around humanity was seen to be servants, second-tier life, designed to accommodate human beings. Francis took animal life more seriously than that. Upon coming across a flock of birds, he announced that the birds needed to hear the gospel just like human beings did. And the legend goes that he stopped and preached to the birds, and that all of them listened and not one of them flew away. Often you'll see bird baths in people's gardens with a statue of St. Francis in it, with birds seated on his shoulder or hands. Sometimes you'll see images of Francis alongside a wolf. That's because there was another story about a wolf that was terrorizing a town, and the townspeople had in mind to kill the wolf. But Francis instead spoke to the wolf and worked out an arrangement in which, if the townspeople would feed the wolf would leave them alone, and they wouldn't kill the wolf. Bonaventure's biography is filled with stories about animals flocking to Francis. Bunnies would seek him out and jump into his arms. Birds would land on his shoulders. He had a pet lamb that would follow him everywhere he went. It would even go into church with him, and when he prayed, the lamb would bow down. He gave the lamb to a woman to take care of. And the story goes that on Sunday mornings when it was time for church, the lamb would bleat and bump into her with its little horns to wake her up to make sure that she was on time to church. There were stories about Francis' prayer life. He would often go off and be alone to pray, just like Jesus. He would go into empty churches and pray all night by himself, so that his followers had to come looking for him. There were stories of him being attacked by demons in physical form when he sought out these nights of prayer. It's actually reminiscent of the life of St. Anthony, a book that was written by Athanasius before the life of Augustine, and which profoundly shaped the thinking of Augustine and a lot of medieval thought after him. Bonaventure's biography of Francis was a significant influence on all those who would study Francis and seek to become a Franciscan, and it is to this day a pleasant read. In 1219, when Francis was around the age of 38, the Fifth Crusade was raging. Francis sought to bring peace to war-torn lands. He went to Egypt to preach the gospel to the Sultan al-Kamil and maybe become a martyr. Instead, he was greeted kindly by the Sultan, and though the Sultan heard him, there's little evidence that it made any difference, and Francis returned home. In 1220, there was some conflict within the order, and Francis handed the order over to the leadership of Peter Catani. He continued to do ministry and serve among the poor. He did make one lasting impact on the worship of the church, something that affects the way we worship today. In 1223, he brought live animals into the church to create a living manger scene. This had never been done before. This was sensationalism. And yet, all the manger scenes we see out on the lawns trace their way back to Francis. In fact, churches today that bring live animals into their worship services at Christmas are simply borrowing from the playbook of Francis of Assisi. In 1224, in a time of intense prayer, Francis received the stigmata in his body, the holes that Christ received on the cross in his hands and his feet and his side. This is said to be a divine sign and gift because of Francis' intense contemplation of the cross. In 1226, Francis would die. A short life that changed the history of the world. The spirit of St. Francis is captured in a prayer that he left behind, a prayer that's still said today, one that you might recognize. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life.